Well, so this is only an hour, so I'm going to get right into my talk, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards, okay? So how many of you have read Invisible Man? That's a pretty good number, so I'm expecting more of you to raise your hand by the end of the semester, right? As this will be leisure reading for you, okay? So let's get to it. Unable to contain his emotions, Ralph Ellison cried. He leaned on the shoulder of one of the students present at the reception, and he wept. It was as if he could no longer maintain the stoic facade that deflected. He deflected unsolicited criticism from white and black readers, black militants attacking his apolitical position, and race men desiring to co-opt him, his work, and his art in an effort to infiltrate the white establishment for their own personal gain. What precipitated this unusual scene was a confrontation between Ellison and a 20-something African-American man who had driven almost 5 hours to literally crash the party attended by the author. In the fall of 1967, Ellison, along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Willie Morris, Fred Friendly, the artist Robert Rauschenberg, musician Louis Armstrong, and other notable celebrities, scholars, and politicians, were at Grinnell College attending a 3-day symposium titled The Liberal Arts College in a World of Change. Ellison participated in a panel discussion on urban culture and the Negro, and was singled out by students wanting to expose all the hypocrisies of the day. The next day, at a reception, crowded with students, conversing with some of the visitors, including Ellison, the young man who had driven from Chicago on his motorcycle to Grinnell confronted the writer. About the confrontation, Ellison's biographer, Arnold Rampersad, writes, and I quote, "Cornering Ralph, he and another black youngster got into a vehement argument with him about Invisible Man. Suddenly, the black jacketed man turned to Ralph. 'You're an Uncle Tom, man,' he shouted. 'You're a sellout. You're a disgrace to your race.' Conversation stopped in mid-sentence as everyone turned to watch Ralph. 'I resent being called an Uncle Tom,' Ralph responded, visibly controlling his emotions. 'You don't know what you're talking about. What do you know about my life? It's easy for you. You're just straw in the wind. Get on your motorcycle and go back to Chicago, throw some Molotov cocktails. That's all you'll ever know about.' Clearly, the young man, African-American man, wished to expose Ellison as a sellout to the black race by identifying him as an Uncle Tom, a reference to Harriet Beecher Stowe's tragic, self-sacrificing black character. In a moment frozen in time, disbelief, confusion, and utter shock, silence filled the room. Quickly, the young black male who had been disruptive was escorted away from the chaos he had initiated. However, the damage had been done. His comments had struck a nerve in Ellison. Unable to hold back his emotions, he sobbed into the shoulder of Henry Wingate, an African-American student at the college. The dejected Ellison, speaking in a low tone, repeatedly said, "I'm not an Uncle Tom. I'm not an Uncle Tom." By most accounts, the scene was unbearable to watch. The armor that served to protect had failed him and cracked. What had infuriated the young African-American man so much that he chose to travel from Chicago to Iowa to confront Ellison face to face? What did this particular assault, or rather, why did this particular assault strike a nerve with Ellison? Surely he had been confronted with accusations like this before. What was different about this situation? How are we to understand the value of Invisible Man within the context of the 1960s Black Power movement, Black identity development, and the ideas about Black masculinity and manhood? And finally, what can we learn from this book and Ralph Ellison's life and work as one of America's most celebrated writers and essayists? Can his analysis of American life, culture, and politics reveal solutions to our daily struggles with identity, justice, and equality? These are but a few questions to ponder for you to think about as we explore Ellison's masterful work of art. A little bit about Ellison. Born in 1913 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Ellison's parents, Lewis and Ida, migrated to the Midwest from South Carolina. They settled in the wide open state, looking to take advantage of the opportunities to establish a foundation and a legacy for their children. Named after the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, Ellison's father wanted his son to grow up to be a man of letters. Unfortunately, after a tragic accident, Lewis Ellison died. Ralph was just 3 years old at the time. His untimely death sent the family into a tailspin. Ralph's mother, Ida, took work as a domestic. She remarried 3 times and struggled to support her 2 children and herself adequately. Ralph and his younger brother, Herbert, found themselves under the guidance and the direction of members of the community, protecting its own from uncertainty. In his youth, Ellison learned to play the trumpet and the saxophone. His penchant for music would win him a scholarship to the Tuskegee Institute in 1933, where he studied with the founder of the music department, the exacting William Levy Dawson. To be sure, Ellison struggled financially to stay in school. His mother sent him what she could, but he was essentially on his own, and he had to make it work. He took a position as a baker and then a server in the dining room at Tuskegee to pay for his music fees and his room and board. As fate would have it, he found other employment in the new campus library, working for the head librarian, Walter Williams. There he discovered T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which opened his eyes to the complexities of literature and how it could mimic jazz in structure and appearance, and a feeling of freedom and convention, and a feeling of freedom from convention. I got it out, thank you. This was the beginning of an idea, a window into the possibilities of using language to transfix and transform the reader. Over the course of the first 2 years at Tuskegee, Ellison grew as a musician, becoming the student leader of the band, showing off his conducting skills, his command of the trumpet, and a little flair every once in a while. He also grew to appreciate other arts, including painting, sculpture, and of course, literature. In the summer of 1936, he left for New York to find work and save enough to return for his final year at Tuskegee. Ellison found a place to stay at the Harlem YMCA on West 135th Street, where he met Langston Hughes, who introduced him to Richard Wright. In a 1955 interview with the Paris Review, Ellison discussed the influences on his approach to prose, fiction, and poetry. The interviewers, Alfred Chester and Vilma Howard, initially asked him why he gave up jazz. Ellison responded, "I didn't give up music, but I became interested in writing, through incessant reading. In 1935, I discovered Eliots The Wasteland, which moved and intrigued me, but defied my powers of analysis, such as they were. And I wondered why I had never read anything of equal intensity and sensibility by an American Negro writer. Later on, in New York, I read a poem by Richard Wright, who, as luck would have it, came to town the next week. He was editing a magazine called The New Challenge and asked me to try a book review. On the basis of this review, Wright suggested that I try a short story, which I did. I tried to use my knowledge of riding freight trains. He liked the story well enough to accept it, and I got in the galley, but unfortunately the magazine died after the first issue. The observers, or rather the interviewers, "But you went on writing." Ellison responded, "With difficulty, because this was the recession of 1937. I went to Dayton, Ohio, where my brother and I hunted and sold game to earn a living. At night, I practiced writing and studied Joyce, Dostoevsky, Stein, and Hemingway, especially Hemingway. I read him to learn his sentence structure and how to organize a story. I guess many readers, especially young writers, were doing the same thing, but I also used his description of hunting when I went into the fields the next day. I had been hunting since I was 11, but no one had broken down the process of wing shooting to me. And it was from reading Hemingway that I learned to lead a bird. When he describes something in print, believe him. Believe him even when he describes the process of art in terms of baseball or boxing. He's been there. Ellison's love of reading, his observations of style and technique of other writers, his love of music, and his affinity for jazz especially, would shape his approach to writing and, most importantly, his career. When Invisible Man appeared in 1952, the reading public was taken aback by its opening pages. From the text, I am an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorted glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Nor is my invisibility exactly a matter of a biochemical accident to my epidermis. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come in contact, a matter of the construction of their inner eye, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. I'm not complaining, nor am I protesting either. It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves. Then, two, you're constantly being bumped against by those of poor vision. Or again, you often doubt if you really exist. You wonder whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds, say a figure in a nightmare which the sleeper tries with all his strength to destroy. It's when you feel like this that, out of resentment, you begin to bump people back. And let me confess, you feel like that most of the time. You ache with the need to convince yourself that you do exist in the real world, that you are part of all the sound and anguish, and you strike out with your fist, you curse and you swear to make them recognize you. And alas, it's seldom successful. One night, I accidentally bumped into a man, and perhaps because of the near darkness, he saw me and called me an insulting name. I sprang at him, seized his coat lapels, and demanded that he apologize. He was a tall, blond man, and as my face came close to his, he looked insolently at me through those blue eyes and cursed me, his breath hot in my face as he struggled. I pulled his chin down sharp upon the crown of my head, butting him as I had seen the West Indians do. And I felt his flesh tear and the blood gush out. And I yelled, "Apologize, apologize." But he continued to curse and struggle. I butted him again and again until he went down heavily on his knees, profusely bleeding. I kicked him repeatedly in a frenzy because he still uttered insults through his lips that were frothy with blood. Oh yes, I kicked him. And in my outrage, I got out my knife and prepared to slit his throat. Right there, beneath the lamplight, in the deserted street, holding him in the collar with one hand and opening the blade with my teeth, when it occurred to me that the man had not seen me. Actually, that he, as far as he knew, was in the midst of a walking nightmare. And I stopped the blade, slicing the air as I pushed him away, letting him fall back to the street. I stared at him as the lights of a car stabbed through the darkness. He lay there, moaning on the asphalt, a man almost killed by a phantom. It is here at the beginning where we see the complexity of the protagonist as a self-aware individual seeking confirmation of his humanity. He desires nothing more than to be seen as a real human being, and I quote, "a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and having a mind." He would like to be fully realized for his capacity to live like those who refuse to see him. Throughout the novel, Ellison addresses individualism, racism, sexism, religion, capitalism, folklore, myth, struggle, improvisation, politics, resistance, resilience, rural life versus urban dwelling, colorism, poverty, and education. An unnerving reflection of how power functions. I forgot the slide so you can catch up. How power functions in a capitalist society and what progress looks like to those situated in the margins. The book and its themes are actually relevant to today's social, cultural, and political environment. Written during the Cold War, Invisible Man was a monumental accomplishment. Its reception as a work of art and the recognition of the author as a literary genius was significant. I remind you that this was a time in American history when African Americans were still being terrorized throughout the South, and opportunities for social, political, and economic advancement were limited. Published 2 years before Brown versus the Board of Education, 4 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, and little more than a decade before the March on Washington, Invisible Man became a standard bearer for the untapped potential of Black creative genius. Ellison's star rose overnight. In 1953, Ellison was awarded the National Book Award for Fiction, which catapulted him into unknown territory for African American writers. To be sure, there were other African American novelists who achieved recognition for their artistic vision and output. Richard Wright, Ann Peachtree, Frank Yerby, and Gwendolyn Brooks, to mention a few. In fact, in 1940, Richard Wright published Native Son, which was recognized as a protest novel, which also was unapologetic in representing the consequences of American society's conditioning of African American men to be violent reactionaries. This same Wright would become a mentor to Ralph Ellison. But it was Ellison who had broken through. He had reached the pinnacle of literary success. For some, he became a conquering hero who had used his talent and insight to potentially influence the course of race relations in America. For others, as we shall see, he failed as a race man to advance the program for Black liberation from white oppression, abuse, and exploitation. So, mixed reviews. In 1953, the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke. How many of you have heard of the Harlem Renaissance? It's getting better. It's getting better. The dean of the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke, who had been the mentor to writers, and raise your hand if you know the names, Langston Hughes, better, Zora Neale Hurston, good, and the artist Jacob Lawrence. 5 of you, interesting. That's interesting. Okay, I need to teach again. He wrote a review of Invisible Man that appeared in Phylon, which was a journal published by Atlanta University, which is over in AU. In the review, Locke writes, keep up here. But in 1952 is the significant year of Ellison's Invisible Man, a great novel, although not without its artistic flaws, sad to say. Ralph Ellison is a protege of Richard Wright, who predicted for him a bright literary future. Written in a style of great force and originality, although its talent is literally smothered with verbosity and hyperbole, Invisible Man is both in style and conception a new height of literary achievement. The life story of its hero, obviously semi-autobiographic, ranges from the typical South of a few years back to the metropolitan North of New York and vicinity. Conceptually, it runs also almost the whole gamut of class in American society and is interracial at all stages, even in the Deep South, from the benefactor patron of the college visiting for Founders Day to the sinister crackers of the rural backwoods. It is, in fact, one of the best integrated accounts of interaction between whites and Negroes in American society that has yet been presented, with all the characters portrayed in the same balance and perspective. As a work of fiction, Invisible Man has been elevated as one of the most important examples of narrative storytelling of the 20th century. Considering the fact that Ellison was competing with the likes of William Carlos Williams, Ernest Hemingway, and John Steinbeck, his novel stood out for its originality and stinging commentary, again, on racism, classism, communism, American politics, and race relations. And an exploration of double consciousness, a concept described by W.E.B. Du Bois in his 1903 publication, Souls of Black Folk. About double consciousness, Du Bois writes, "After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no self-consciousness but only lets him see himself through the revelations of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He does not wish to Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He does not wish to bleach his Negro blood in a flood of white Americanism, for he believes, foolishly perhaps, but fervently, that Negro blood has yet a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without losing the opportunity for self-development. Ironically, Du Bois's observation of what it means to be black in America still resonates in the 21st century. The reality of being a part of and yet reminded daily that the group, as a group they are apart from, persist. Now I'm going to pause. So I've introduced you all to Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Jacob Lawrence, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright. Are all these new for some of you? Just say yes if it is. Are they new for you? Yes. Oh my gosh, this is not, this. You guys know call and response? I say something, you respond, okay? How many of you had never heard of Langston Hughes, of Ralph Ellison, of all the people I mentioned? How many of you have never heard of these people before? Say, I haven't. Oh my God. You guys are not going to play well. This is serious. Come on now. Have you heard of these people before? Yes or no? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Part of the story of Ralph Ellison is understanding the context. Who are these people? If you know the people, if you don't know the people, it's important to know who was around him, what they were writing, what their experiences were, because that would dictate or have some influence on how they received the novel, and therefore how he interacted with these particular people. Does that make sense? Okay. You guys got to keep up, man. Okay, so still Ellison's literary accomplishment was on par. Now, I know you've heard of this one. On par with Homer. Yes? What's the major book? Iliad and Odyssey, right? I mean, you know, there's several books within, yeah, you know that one. Good for you. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground and Herman Melville's, see, this is why we're doing this today, Moby Dick. These works of art, held up as classics apparently, chronicle the lives of individuals in search of themselves amidst challenges, some unimaginable, whereby they are forced to reveal their true nature as human beings and as men. When challenged by life, were these men courageous, cowardly, or reticent? Did they rise to the occasion, or did they shrink into obscurity? In Invisible Man, Ellison's Southern-born protagonist is naive and easily manipulated by different people. Born within chances and circumstances beyond his control, he is conditioned to make decisions. Get away. He is conditioned to make decisions based on the desires of others, so he makes no decisions at all. His obstacle-laden pathway and his eventual triumph is prophesied by his grandfather, who, on his deathbed, reveals his own misgivings and regrets. See if we can get it there. It goes a long way back, some 20 years. All my life, I had been looking for something, and everywhere I turned, someone trying to tell me what it was. I accepted their answers too, though they were often in contradiction and even self-contradictory. I was naive. I was looking for myself and asking everyone except myself questions which I and only I could answer. It took me a long time and much painful boomeranging of my expectations to achieve a realization everyone else appears to have been born with, that I am nobody but myself. But first I had to discover that I am an invisible man. And yet, I am no freak of nature, nor of history. I was in the cards, other things having been equal or unequal, 80 years ago, 85 years ago. I am not ashamed of my grandparents for having been slaves. I am only ashamed of myself for having at one time been ashamed. About 85 years ago, they were told that they were free, united with others of our country in everything pertaining to the common good and in everything social, separate like the fingers of a hand. And they believed it. They exalted in it. They stayed in their place, worked hard, and brought up my father to do the same. But my grandfather is the one. He was an odd old guy, my grandfather, and I am told I take after him. It was he who caused the trouble. On his deathbed, he called my father and said to him, "Son, after I am gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country ever since I give up my gun back in the Reconstruction. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. Let them swallow you whole till they vomit or bust wide open." Ultimately, it is a culmination of the protagonist's observations, decisions, experiences, and individual initiatives which leads him on this series of revelations regarding his purpose in life and what he thinks his purpose is or should be. How will he make himself relevant to those refusing to see his value as a human being and a man? He would model himself after the most successful black man in America, at least in the South. And who was that? Come on, Joe, you can't say that. Oh, boy, Joe, thank you. The old man's words were like a curse. On my graduation day, I delivered an oration in which I showed that humility was the secret. Indeed, the very essence of progress. Not that I believe this, how could I, remembering my grandfather? I only believe that it worked. It was a great success. Everyone praised me, and I was invited to give the speech at a gathering of the town's leading white citizens. It was a triumph for our whole community. Here, in this opening chapter of the book, Ellison's powerful use of allegory demonstrates his novel's value as an unflinching critique of American society through the expectations of his protagonists. And as he, too, has observed and lived it, Ellison would show it. So this is a long passage I'm going to read, so prepare yourself, okay? It's long, but it's necessary. It was in the main ballroom of the leading hotel. When I got there, I discovered that it was on the occasion of a smoker, and I was told that since I was going to be there anyway, I might as well take part in the Battle Royale to be fought by some of my schoolmates as part of the entertainment. The Battle Royale came first. All the town's big shots were there in their tuxedos, wolfing down the buffet foods, drinking beer and whiskey and smoking black cigars. It was a large room with a high ceiling. Chairs were arranged in neat rows around three sides of the portable boxing ring. The fourth side was clear, revealing a gleaming square of polished floor. I had some misgivings over the Battle Royale, by the way, not from a distaste for fighting, but because I didn't care too much for the other fellows who were to take part. They were tough guys who seemed to have no grandfather's curse worrying their minds. No one could mistake their toughness, and besides, I suspected that fighting a battle royal might detract from the dignity of my speech. In those pre-Invisible days, I visualized myself as a potential Booker T. Washington. But the other fellows didn't care too much for me either, and there were 9 of them. I felt superior to them in my way, and I didn't like the manner in which we were all crowded together into the servants' elevator. Nor did I like my being there, period. In fact, as the warmly lighted floors flashed past the elevator, we had words over the fact that I, by taking part in the fight, had knocked one of their friends out of a night's work. We were led out of the elevator through a rococo hall into an anteroom and told to get into our fighting togs. Each of us was issued a pair of boxing gloves and ushered into the big mirrored hall, which we entered, looking cautiously about us and whispering, lest we might accidentally be heard above the noise of the room. It was foggy with cigar smoke, and already the whiskey was taking effect. I was shocked to see some of the most important men of the town quite tipsy. They were all there, bankers, lawyers, judges, doctors, 5 chiefs, teachers, merchants, even one of the more fashionable pastors. Something we could not see was going on up front. A clarinet was vibrating sensuously, and the men were all standing up and moving eagerly forward. We were a small, tight group clustered together, our bare upper bodies touching and shining with anticipatory sweat, while up front, the big shots were becoming increasingly excited over something we still could not see. Suddenly, I heard the school superintendent, who had told me to come, yell, "Bring up the shines, gentlemen, bring up the little shines." We were rushed up to the front of the ballroom, where it smelled even more strongly of tobacco and whiskey. Then we were pushed into place. I almost wet my pants. A sea of faces, some hostile, some amused, ringed around us. And in the center, facing us, stood a magnificent blonde, stark naked. There was dead silence. I felt a blast of cold air chill me. I tried to back away, but they were behind me and around me. Some of the boys stood and lowered their heads, trembling. I felt a wave of irritational guilt and fear. My teeth chattered, my skin turned to goose flesh, my knees knocked. Yet I was strongly attracted and looked in spite of myself. Had the price of looking been blindness, I would have looked. The hair was yellow, like that of a circus Cupid doll, the face heavily powdered and rouged, as though to form an abstract mask, the eyes hollow and smeared with cool blue, the color of a baboon's butt. I felt a desire to spit upon her as my eyes brushed slowly over her body. Her breasts were firm and round as the domes of East Indian temples, and I stood so close as I could see the fine hair, skin texture, and beads of pearly perspiration glistening like dew around the pink and erect nipples of her body. I wanted at one and at the same time to run from the room, to sink through the floor, to go to her and cover her from my eyes and the eyes of the others with my body, to feel the soft thighs, to caress her and destroy her, to love her and murder her, to hide from her, and yet to stroke where below the small American flag tattooed upon her belly, her thighs formed a capital V. I had a notion that of all in the room, she only saw me with her impersonal eyes. You have to pause for that one. So the Battle Royale scene was absolutely brutal. Pitted against one another, these young African-American men fight out of fear and see no clear way out of their circumstances. Who can they turn to? The pastor? The school superintendent? No one. Each is complicit in the maintenance of this particular tradition in the community used to reaffirm their individual and collective identities. After the Battle Royale, our protagonist is given the opportunity to give his speech. We had dressed the MC. We had addressed the MC, and he came in and gave us $5 each, except Tatlock, who got $10 for being the last in the ring. Then he told us, leave. I was not to get a chance to deliver my speech, I thought. I was going out into the dim alley in despair when I was stopped and told to go back in. I returned to the ballroom where the men were pushing back their chairs and gathering in groups to talk. The MC knocked on the table for quiet. Gentlemen, he said, we almost forgot an important part of the program, a most serious part, gentlemen. This boy was brought here to deliver a speech which he made at the graduation yesterday. Bravo! I'm told that he is the smartest boy we've got there in Greenwood. I'm told that he knows more big words than a pocket-sized dictionary. Much applause and laughter. So now, gentlemen, I want you to give him your attention. There was still laughter as I faced them, my mouth dry, my eye throbbing. I began slowly, but eventually my throat was tense because they began shouting, louder, louder. We of the younger generation extol the wisdom of that great leader and educator, I shouted, who first spoke these flaming words of wisdom. A ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen a signal. Water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel came back, cast down your bucket where you are. The captain of the distressed vessel, at last heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket, and it came up full of fresh, sparkling water from the mouth of the Amazon River. And like him, I say, and in these words, to those of my race who depend upon bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the southern white man, who is his next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your buckets where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. And he goes on to repeat this speech. And at one point, he slips. The room filled with the uproar of laughter until, no doubt, distracted by having to gulp down my blood, I made a mistake and yelled a phrase I had often seen denounced in newspaper editorials, heard debated in private. Social! What? They yelled. Equality! The laughter hung, smoke-like, in the sudden stillness. I opened my eyes, puzzled. Sounds of displeasure filled the room. The MC rushed forward. They shouted hostile phrases at me, but I did not understand. A small, dry, mustached man in the front row blurted out, "Say that slowly, son." "What, sir?" "What you just said." "Social responsibility, sir," I said. "You weren't being smart, were you, boy?" he said, not unkindly. "No, sir." "You sure about that? Equality was a mistake?" "Oh, yes, sir," I said. "I was swallowing blood." "Well, you had better speak more slowly so we can understand. We mean to do right by you, but you got to know your place at all times." Ellison's philosophy of characterization, incisive, realistic, unsparingly of physical and psychological detail, all his major characters are stripped bare to the skin and bone, so to speak, is close to the best European realism in that it is so three-dimensional. We see a grand caravan of types all registered first person on the senses, on the sensitive but rather cynical retina of the young Negro protagonists. In the South, the patronizing but well-intentioned school trustee, the piously hypocritical Negro school principal, the gouache, naive, but not too honest students, the disillusioned institutional war veterans, the townfolk, the peasants of the countryside, white and black, and most particularly the unforgettable earthy peasant character Jim Trueblood. In the North, the pageant resumes with all sorts and manner of men and women, the financiers of Wall Street and their decadent jazz-loving sons, factory workers, pro and anti-union varieties, the urban peasants and their homely oddities, parlor pinks, and hard inner core communists, race leaders, educated and illiterate, each after his kind, and the Harlem community generally displayed finally at a frenetic tension in one of its big authentic riots. For Ellison's protagonists, the choice to retreat into himself underground is an attempt to gain clarification and an understanding of what is real and what is imagined in a world bent on measuring and judging him based on what he looks like, or his predetermined purpose in a system designed to devour human beings as sport. Larry Neal, one of the architects of the Black Arts Movement. How many of you heard of Larry Neal? Okay, remember Larry Neal's name, Black Arts Movement, okay? Whew. That's all right. Writing reflected his understanding of the novel, Ellison's novel, as a foundation or form from which to express cultural or social differences, nuances otherwise lost to the general reader, which is coded white here. So Neal writes, much of Ellison's concern with the major literary figures of Europe and America emanates from his sincere belief that it is the duty of every writer, black and white, to be fully aware of the best that has ever been written. For Ellison, that was never meant becoming a white man. It meant bringing to bear on literature and language the force of one's own sensibility and modes of feeling. It meant learning the craft of fiction, even from white artists, but dominating that craft so much that you don't play like the other fellow anymore. That trumpet you got in your hand may have been made in Germany, but you sure sound like my Uncle Rufus whooping his homecoming call across the cotton fields. Again, music was the basis for Ellison's exploration of spaces within a novel structure. Blind spots, if you will, where the writer can explore, attack, and retreat. You got that part? He used the novel as a platform, as a vector, but like a jazz musician, he knew where those spaces were to say something. According to Ellison, the hero's invisibility is not a matter of being seen, but a refusal to run the risk of his own humanity, which involves guilt. This is not an attack upon white society. It is what the hero refuses to do in each section, which leads to further action. He must assert and achieve his own humanity. He cannot run with the pack and do this. This is the reason for all the reversals. For Ellison, individualism was key to freedom and liberation. Make yourself the best you can be by accepting and modeling the attributes recognized as honorable in society. To conclude, Ellison's own life experiences, his struggles and disappointments, influenced the man he had become by the 1960s. His cool, cosmopolitan presentation of himself appeared to be more aligned with conservative blacks, identified by militant blacks as sellouts, who scrambled to get theirs and were not at all concerned about the communities or the people who looked like them or their ongoing suffering. Ellison's own Horatio Alger's story did not appeal to the black militant class living in the urban environs overrun by rats, gangs, violence, families trying to make a living with little access to real prospects for steady employment, men and women unable to provide their children with enough food, adequate shelter, and access to a quality education. These people were left behind by all of society, but found it especially hurtful when their own turned a blind eye towards their problems, reinforcing their already socially, economically, and politically affirmed invisibility. By 1967, when the young man confronted him at Grinnell College, Ellison was a bit out of touch with the fact that African American youth had collectively grown exceedingly impatient with the status quo and were unapologetic in their vocalization and action-oriented approach to expressing their discontent in the pursuit of freedom and liberation. Young people were also using the visual arts, poetry, playwriting, and fiction to confront the establishment, white supremacy, white complacency, capitalism, and the military-industrial complex. Along with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, Black arts movement participant practitioners sought to use every resource at their disposal to dismantle the system that maintained the oppression of Black people. They were determined to change the course of history by any means necessary. In reference to Ellison, the poet Amir Baraka, who was another founder of the Black arts movement, is quoted saying that the most dangerous thing in the world is a skilled artist with backward ideas, end quote. Ellison's ideas weren't necessarily backwards, outdated but not backwards. In his isolation as a writer who was self-conscious of his own feelings, his dilemmas and challenges, as well as his aspirations, he had grown distant from the world that had shifted beneath his feet. In reality, he was in some ways a relic, someone who had found value in the tried and true ways of measuring one's success through an accumulation of awards and recognition that proclaimed his worth. In other ways, he was a griot, seeing beyond the chaos and confusion, providing some insight into the problems faced by the masses, even if it was at a distance. In the end, Ellison was an artist who communicated his ideas, thoughts, and vision through his writing to those who could see a world of possibility through literature. Thank you. I did it in 40 minutes. It's pretty good. Any questions? Yes.
So what you're saying is that because Ellison's assessment of his own self was individualistic, meaning he's an invisible man, he's focusing on how to resolve this situation through self-reflection, it didn't fit so well with social movements because they have to be more
Out. Yeah.
out there and they have to, put their foot in the fire and they have to. But couldn't they read the novel and see the value of individualism
I think, so the question is, Ellison's self kind of reflecting exercise in writing this novel, but also as a writer, sometimes did not translate to people who were in the movement, right? So they may have read the book, like the young man read the book that confronted him at the beginning, and he didn't agree with the book because this is what he saw, that the protagonist retreats into the basement. He's not active in the movement. In other words, he's a coward. He's not participating in this liberation process. At the same time, with Ellison and other writers, you need people who can see the big picture, because generally, when we're talking about isolated communities, and let's say Detroit, I won't pick on Detroit, let's say Oakland, California. I grew up in the Bay Area, so I had the Black Panther Party was part of my upbringing in terms of the free breakfast program and their social movement and community programs that were part of the Bay Area. And Patrick probably doesn't remember these things, but Kathleen Cleaver and a number of the members still lived in the Bay Area. So they were participating in the outward expression of this frustration by assisting people in pushing for this equality, this freedom and liberation. Whereas writers were not necessarily retreating into their corners or into their holes. They were thinking about these things, but they were thinking about it at a different level. But there are different kinds of writers, right? So the novelist is different from the essayist, and the essayist is different from the poet. But each of them are trying to create this pathway towards freedom and liberation. Who reads what also matters. Yes?
Can you explain the photo?
This was from an art show, I want to say it was back in 2002. It was an installation, not at MoMA, but one of the New York galleries, maybe it was the Met. I can find out some more information.
Is that Ellison? Is it a
No, it's not. It was someone interpreting Invisible Man.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I know there's a section of the novel where Ellison kind of confronts that idea because the protagonist becomes the head of this Harlem Renaissance activist movement, and he kind of implies that he just becomes a puppet for the white heads of the movement.
Right.
So I'm not sure did that young black man at that lecture did he not understand that section or not take that into account? Because I feel like that was a very relevant part of the novel.
Right, the dancing sambo, remember the doll? I mean, that was, again, a metaphor that he was using, that, people who are participating not just in the Communist Party, if you're African American, the one thing you all have to remember, and not remember, maybe you have to learn this, is that prior to the Cold War, and I'd say the 1930s, the African Americans were being pursued by the Communist Party internally in the country because they were providing kind of the voice of oppressed black people. The Scottsboro Boys case in Alabama in the 1930s really accelerated the participation of African Americans, especially in urban environments like New York and Detroit and Chicago, because they're the only ones who came to the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. The NAACP did not do anything about it, but the Communist Party went and supported it. One of the collections we have in the Rose Library, forgive me, I'm having a moment right now. We have so many collections. William Patterson and Louise Thompson Patterson, her husband, William Patterson. William Patterson was actually on the ticket to be the president of the Communist Party. He's an African-American man. And his wife, Louise Thompson Patterson, she and Langston Hughes were best friends. Langston Hughes was never out and out a communist, but he had sentiments, right? So in some of his writing, you would find him like the Jesse B. Simple series. He says, when a man sees red, you never know what he's thinking. And so he was called before the Un-American Activities, Committee, and he said, well, he's just tired. When he's tired, he sees red. His eyes are red. When in fact he was speaking about the Communist Party. Yes.
So in regards to contemporary black thought, which school of thinking do you think has had the greatest impact? The school of thinking exhibited by the young man or Ralph Ellison's beliefs?
I think all of them have. And I think those are just two that we've identified. If we think about even the civil rights movement, right? You have a situation where you have people who believe that Malcolm X's approach was the best approach. This is before his conversion, right? Before he goes to Mecca. And then you have folks who see King's approach being the most effective. But what we don't necessarily recognize is that they're in two different parts of the world, the South and the North. And the rhetoric and the language and the approach they're taking, they're specific to those spaces. What happens and what works in Selma and in Birmingham maybe won't work in Detroit or Oakland or New York. What happens in New York and Detroit and Southern California sure as heck wouldn't work in Mobile, Alabama, right? So I think if it's about achieving freedom and liberation, by all means necessary, figure out how to make this work. If we're trying to communicate to people in different parts of the world who have different circumstances, even if it's class, right? How do you communicate to those people what they need to do to secure their freedom, if not the freedom for their entire community? I think what Ellison is doing with the book is, through this protagonist, he's showing us the world that we live in. The world of the protagonist is our world, but he has this vantage point where he's seen everything. But he also has to be self-reflective to understand. He has to see himself. He has to understand, what have I become? And what do I want to become? How do I want to be seen? Or at least by myself, right? Because again, the confrontation with these different characters in the book, it's based on what they see. They really don't see him because he doesn't see himself. One more question? Yes.
When Du Bois writes in Salty Black Book, like that he wants to be a part of Shakespeare and Hegel in that particular world, it's terribly moving, as it were, to the so-called dispassionate observer. And yet, so many years later, he has to leave America
Yes.
to get outside of it. When Ellison is asked, why don't you leave America, much later in his life, he says there's two things that keep me here: the Constitution and jazz.
Yeah.
Right? I just wonder, in the current climate, putting those two figures into the current climate, who can look so retrograde in the present climate of opinion?
Yes.
How do you see their influence is really formative on how we should be thinking, or how we might think today?
I think Invisible Man, Song of Solomon, and I've always had a third novel that I refer to as something that's influenced me. And of course, Souls of Black Folk. Those are, I think, three of the most important books for me. Du Bois's exacting kind of analysis of this idea of double consciousness, I think it's important because it's also, I think anyone can use that in their own personal lives. If you are feeling alienated within the country that you were born in, this idea of this two-ness, I'm both American, but I'm a Native American, and so therefore I fit in a particular way. I just can't be. And that the struggles that we have individually and collectively, I think that particular analysis allows for us to have a common language. The idea of individualism and the idea of being invisible at the same time that Ellison argues is also important because it activates this idea of double consciousness in a way that we can see how people can be manipulated for other people or other institutions or other systems kind of gain. The idea that people are fodder, or that the abuse is part of a kind of a ritual activity, as a tradition, is something we have to identify. Capitalism functions in numerous ways that we don't understand. Hegemony, right? So through, I think, the novel and some of these other kinds of texts, we can have a common language and have some clear understanding of how to respond to these different pressures. But the problem that we have, if I can say that, is that the action steps and what is the end goal. So we can identify these issues and the problems they create, but what is the end goal? We can say equality, but what does that look like? How do we actualize that? And what are the steps? And then how do we remember where we've come from so we don't repeat that, right? So I think revisiting these texts and listening to these arguments when they're in the heat of these moments is necessary for us to understand how to respond to where we're at today.
Pellom, thanks very much
Thank you.
indeed.